Right, so natural selection and Darwin, probably one of the most popular sort of examples here is the peppered moth to illustrate the features of natural selection. So here we can see some peppered moths. It's on a tree here. We can see we've got a black peppered moth there, and we've got white ones here, or grey ones. But I guess what this diagram is trying to show you is that against the dark background of this tree bark, this black one is sort of camouflaged, and this one sticks out really, really prominently. I mean, to our eyes and to this close-up diagram, of course you're going to say, I can see both. But if this is on a tree trunk and you're a bird, a predator, for example, and you're flying past a tree really fast, which one of these two is probably going to stick out to you? It's going to be this one. So if you're going past and the tree is got more white to the bark, then the white form tends to be more camouflaged, and the bird flying past is going to see the dark form. And so this idea about camouflage and peppered moths is used in a lot of textbooks to explain this idea of natural selection. So let's get into it. So Charles Darwin put forward this view at the same time as Wallace as well, and there's three main features to natural selection. The first one is, of course, genetic variation. Okay, let's just make that a little bit bigger. Okay, genetic variation. So in order for natural selection to work, the population has to have a large variation in their genes or in their genome. Okay, and so let's say we're talking about the color or the pigment of the wings here. Okay, if there's no genetic variation in the population, that means every single moth in that population has dark wings, for example. If there is genetic variation, then you might find 90% of them are in this black form, but there is a variation in the color or pigmentation of the moth's wings. So there might be slightly lighter browns, there might be those that are a little bit more gray, and there might be ones that are white and then polka dot. There's slight variations. Of course, that genetic variation means that we can have something called selective pressure. So the first thing is large genetic variation. The second thing is, in order for evolution to occur via this process of natural selection, the second phase is there needs to be some type of selective pressure. Now, what does that mean? There's something that's challenging those organisms to survive. So it could be an environmental factor, right? Like it could be very, very cold one year, you could have a cold snap, so therefore the temperature is extremely low. That could be a selective pressure. It could be predation. So in this instance with our moth, it's going to be predation. Predators are constantly hunting for these moths. That's the pressure that's causing some moths to live and some moths to die. So it could be an environmental, it could be, let's say, a food source. It could be a predator, etc. Now, with this selection pressure, or this selective pressure I should say, another phrase you tend to hear is survival of the fittest. Now, what is the survival of the fittest? Well, in this instance, survival of the fittest means those organisms that have characteristics that are favourable for that selective pressure. So therefore they're more fit to survive that pressure. So in this instance, the moth that is camouflaged, let's say initially we start the moth off on a dark tree. Okay, well actually we're going to do this. Let's say we start the moth off on white trees, and this is what happened in Europe, was that prior to the Industrial Revolution there wasn't much pollution in the air, so therefore most of the trees had a light background, and so therefore the light moths were camouflaged and the dark moths were eaten. Right? So therefore there was genetic variation, and the dark moths were eaten and selected by the birds, and so therefore the numbers of the dark moths went down, the numbers of the white moths went up, and so therefore in the population there was more white moths, therefore they survived to a greater extent, reproduced, and their offspring were white. However, the environment changed here, and there was the Industrial Revolution, which made a lot of soot by burning coal. That caused the tree to change colour in particular areas of England. That of course now meant that the dark form was camouflaged and the white form wasn't. So even though there was only a small amount of dark moths, they survived the selective pressure of the predation, and so their numbers went up and the white numbers went down. Okay, the more of the black forms survived, therefore they were able to reproduce and pass on this characteristic to their offspring, and so the numbers went up for black, went down for white. So survival of the fittest is that term that those that have a favorable characteristic for the selective pressure will survive, and then they would reproduce and pass on that characteristic. Now, something to watch out for, my last point here, something to watch out for is that you don't want to say things like this. You don't want to say, oh, the black ones adapted to the environment. No, they didn't, right? Black ones are already black, the environment changed, and that just so happens that their black coloring was favorable for the selective pressure. Okay, they just didn't all of a sudden go, oh, the environment's gone black, I'm going to change my color. So be very careful how you phrase this in exams, because if as soon as you start saying, oh, the moths adapted to the environment, that's closer to the Lamarckian view of evolution, that we acquire characteristics, which is incorrect. So that's it for natural selection for our peppered moth. Make sure you got these key ideas down, these 1, 2, 3 things here. You've got the key ways to express your words very clearly, which is interesting since I just thought about that sentence structure, and that you can talk about this thing called survival of the fittest. We're going to do another video on this to practice these 3 things here to do with natural selection, and I'll see you in that video.